My guest today is Ed Coambs. Ed is the founder of Healthy Love and Money, an educational website that helps couples develop stronger relationships by working through their money problems. He's also a licensed marriage and family therapist and has a couples counseling practice where he helps couples strengthen their communication and relationship skills on money-related matters. He started as a financial planner with a CFP and an MBA in finance before moving into marriage and family therapy, where he specializes in financial therapy. Ed, thanks so much for joining us today to share your insights on relationships and money.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I'm excited to meet with you and to talk about this important intersection of couples and money.
I'd love to start just by learning a little bit more about your background. Like, how did you get into your field of work, intersecting finance, financial planning, and couples and marriage counseling? I know it's a fairly uncommon hybrid of skills.
I think it's been an unfolding journey. I certainly had no idea that this existed, 10, 15 years ago as I was setting out on a career path. It really was born out of an interest of figuring out personal finance for myself, starting with a career in actual firefighting. So I started out as a professional firefighter and sat around listening to the guys talk about two things: their wives and money. And yeah, you can imagine how some of those conversations went. They, let's just say they weren't always the most favorable conversations. Not all of them were tragic, but there was, you just saw a lot. I saw a lot. You're living with the guys. And so it kind of set me on this course of wanting to figure it out for myself, not wanting to have those same problems. Was aware that my folks had some frustrations around money and with each other. And so I just realized this is a bigger issue. And so the natural solution to that at that point in my life was, well, learn how money works. And I thought, if you just learn how money works and you make enough money, then you shouldn't have any problems. I now realize that's not an uncommon starting point for a lot of people. And it's kind of intuitive and natural. Well, I took things to a little bit of an extreme by getting an MBA in finance and a CFP. Most people won't do that. But I wanted to turn this into my career of helping people, leaving firefighting and becoming a financial planner. And what I just discovered in that process is I also ended up meeting my wife, who was finishing up dental school, and we had to have more money conversations as we were going to get married. And I started realizing this is more complicated than just knowing how to put together a budget and an investment plan and paying off debt. All that knowledge is important, but being able to talk about it and have the same goals and ideas, that's where we were getting off kilter, if you will. I had the good fortune of working at Vanguard Mutual Funds for almost 4 years and talked to a lot of clients and certainly heard some of their concerns and frustrations as well. And so it just said, well, what else is there besides just, if I'm giving the right quote unquote investment advice, financial planning advice, but it's not settling the arguments or it's not helping couples move forward, what's going on? And by this time, I now figured out I really like going to school. And so I went back to school to get my master's in marriage and family therapy. Again, a bit naively, I guess, thinking, well, surely they know something about how to help people. Boy, did I not understand how deep the field of psychology is. I'd come up in the business world and didn't do a lot of reading in psychology. And so really got my eyes opened, and it's been quite a whirlwind since that point. It's been 10 years since I entered the field of psychology and counseling, and I've been practicing for 7 years and have grown a lot in understanding how it is that couples work, what's happening for them when they're interacting around money, and bringing me to today where I have a really good understanding of likely what's going on. I use some major psychological frameworks like attachment theory, which is the study of how babies grow and develop a sense of security in the world in relationships, and that gets carried into the adult intimate relationship, and that's often driving a lot of the money dynamics.
Got it. That's really insightful, and I look forward to jumping into some of the learnings that you've developed along the way. I wanted to sort of structure the conversation into two buckets. One about the types of money issues that arise before, marriage, which is kind of like the big milestone in people's relationship lives, and then the second bucket being how those issues evolve or how new issues arise after a couple gets married. And so if I sort of just double click on that first bucket, the pre-marriage bucket, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about When you first meet and first start dating somebody new, what are some of the questions that you should be asking, or at least some of the behaviors that you should be observing early on to understand your partner's financial values, financial philosophy, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it is a really important part of that uh, developing relationship stage. It's um, kind of screening, right? You want to partner well. And so, what is it that you want to be on the lookout for? And I think one would just be, can you have a conversation about money? Can you ask them about, what is your view of money? Who's responsible for paying for what? Right? Those even simple questions on the surface may elicit an answer, but what you want to look for beneath the surface is, are they comfortable answering those questions that I have about money? And if they're uncomfortable answering the questions about money, then that tells you that they likely have some anxiety or fear around discussing money. Now, that's not inherently bad, or you should stop and put the brakes on it immediately. But what you're really wanting to judge is how comfortable are they to engage in financial conversations? Because what we know is over the arc of your whole intimate life, there are going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of money decisions to be made. And so, what you're wanting to assess is, are we going to be able to partner equally together? If one person's wanting to control and think they're always right about money, and the other person is always kind of acquiescing or giving in, that's not a particularly stable financial arrangement.
Mhm. Got it. When you say, you ask questions like how they view money, who's responsible for paying things, to see how they handle the question in the first place, are you talking about asking these questions with respect to like their specific situation, or asking more of a hypothetical question to just kind of get them sort of opining? Or does it not matter? You're just trying to see how they react to either one.
Well, I think, certainly these are probably not the conversations you're going to have on your first date. But if you're, 3 to 6 months into the relationship and it feels like it's starting to stabilize and it's going to go forward, then yeah, you may want to give some situational questions like, how do you manage your budget? How do you view investing and saving for the future? And you're just asking open-ended, non-threatening questions. We're not looking for a right or wrong answer. We're just trying to draw out their understandings. If you wanted to get a little more risky with those questions, you might ask them, what's a money mistake that you've made in the past? And what have you learned from it? And that type of question, what you're wanting to hear from the partner is, one, are they able to engage in some degree of vulnerability about having made a money mistake? Because the reality is, at the point that you're in an intimate relationship, you've made at least one money mistake somewhere along the way. There's something that you think that you've not done well. And what we want to know as the pursuing partners, can you own that and acknowledge it, and then show that you've learned something from it and talk about how you've changed from that experience, right? So um, I can remember long before I ever met my wife, one of the money mistakes I made early on was co-signing for an ex-girlfriend on a cell phone plan.
Hmm.
And I didn't know better because I didn't know what co-signing really meant. I mean, I just had a crude idea and I wanted to be nice and helpful. And 6 months later, she had stopped paying the phone bill, and I'm getting a call from the cell phone company saying, you owe us, whatever amount of money. So I think a lot of times we can also be wanting to know, are people making financial mistakes out of just a lack of knowledge
Hmm.
and experience? And because we learn about money progressively as we age. So that's really what we want to get at, I think, in that stage of the relationship.
Makes sense. Um, I was also curious, maybe even earlier on in the relationship, maybe before you reach that comfort level, to ask some of these questions. What are some of the behaviors that would be worth observing sooner? Maybe some of the markers that might indicate what the other person's financial values are.
Mm. Well, I mean, one of those things is time and the types of activities that dates you want to go on, right? So a very classic one is restaurant choice. Is there parity in the level of restaurant quality and price point that you want to dine at? If one person is wanting to go out for a really high-end meal and you're wanting to go for, ramen noodles, maybe there's going to be a financial mismatch there, right? If one person's thinking we should be going on really fancy dates and the other one's saying let's do something more practical and free, those are big differences to have to cross. So that's one behavioral example. Another can be just looking at what are those material goods and objects that they have, and are they in alignment with your standard, your own standards of material goods and objects. So you can just be looking at how do they furnish their apartment or their condo or their house? What type of car are they driving? Right. And those are all going to be cues or signals to where their money mindset is at that time.
Yep, makes sense. When you start, having some of the conversations, you mentioned there's like more benign or open-ended questions. There's also, riskier questions you could ask, like the money mistake question you mentioned earlier.
Right.
What are some tips and best practices for asking, more sensitive money-related questions in a way that doesn't provoke a negative reaction by the other person?
Yeah, I think, it takes some degree of relational trust, right? And assuming that you're able to evaluate, yeah, there's enough relational trust. How do you enter into these conversations? And I think maybe what you're saying is, how do I not blindside the other person? And so, I think anytime you're getting into a sensitive conversation in an intimate relationship, prefacing and saying, hey, I'd like to talk to you about something that's really important to me. Is now a good time that we can talk about it, right? So I'd like to, I'm just going to say it, Sally, it's really been great dating you. Money's something that's important to me. You probably picked up on that a little bit along the way. I'd really like to talk with you more intentionally about your views of money and your experiences as, we're getting to know each other. Something along those lines, right? And then Sally feels like she has a chance to either say, yeah, I'm ready to have that conversation, or no, not right now, maybe later. And that even becomes a little bit of an evaluative tool, right?
Mm.
Because if Sally says, oh my God, why do you want to ask that? That defensive response is telling you a lot of information about her openness and willingness to talk about money.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good tip, the prefacing. It gives them an out. It also kind of clues them in about the importance of the conversation ahead. And maybe starting out, they are willing to engage just out of curiosity.
Right.
But as you get into the conversation, you may not know exactly how they're going to react, because money is an emotional topic. And so, how should you handle it if the other person does become defensive, reacts negatively to money-related questions that you're asking?
That's a really great question. And I think, we want to come in from managing our own emotions about it, right? Because we have our own feelings and our needs that we're trying to get met through these conversations. And so if we find that we're getting reactive or wanting to shut down in response to their reactions,
Hmm.
then we probably need to say, oh, okay, I'm just going to pick on Sally today, but all right, Sally, this is getting to be a lot for both of us. Maybe we need to hit the pause button and look at coming back to this later. If you're able to stay relatively calm and emotionally regulated, then you say, hey, Sally, why is this such a big deal for you? What's coming up? Let me see. Let me slow down. I'm saying it very much like a therapist, and I'm wanting to come back into more like a real everyday person. Um, Sally, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to provoke you in this conversation. I can see you're getting upset. Do you want to keep talking about this right now, or do we need to take a break? Right. Again, it's always with that mindset of allowing the partner some freedom and autonomy to back out of the conversation while letting them know that the conversation is still important to you. So that's really always the end goal, right? Is in secure relationships, people don't get put and backed into a corner, right? If you keep pushing them and say, well, why won't you talk to me about this? I want to know more. Why won't you tell me? What are you scared of? That kind of energy is just going to further amplify them. What are you trying to hide, right? That's where you have to really know, how am I coming across to the other person as well? Because that might be part of their reaction.
In that, pardon me. In that regard, do you have any advice for how to even present yourself in asking the questions in order to, minimize that, uh, I guess, adverse reactions that are just based on how you're presenting yourself? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So one of the ideas that I use a lot in my couples counseling, it comes from affect regulation theory, which is a fancy name for how do we manage our emotions. And they say, well, we have this window of tolerance and we have a top limit and a lower limit. And if we're between the upper and lower limit, then we're probably okay. If we go through the top, then we're going to probably be that more aggressive, pushy, anxious presence that's going to provoke the other person into a similar type of response. The other side is if you go through the bottom on the emotional, that's the sadness, withdrawal, flight side of things. This is all autonomic nervous system information, but building your own self awareness. And so that's part of even probably a little more of an advanced skill, but couples can start to use even that. Where are we in our window of tolerance? Are we feeling overwhelmed? Because if we're feeling overwhelmed, we're not going to have productive conversations. So you're having to build self-awareness. That's where you can even ask the other person is, how are you perceiving me right now? Right? Because there can be a gap between our own self-perception and the partner's perception of us. So that opens up some vulnerability for the other person to say, wow, well, I'm experiencing you as really angry or really judgy or really harsh or really critical. Or they might say, no, you seem pretty calm, safe, comfortable. And that's what you want to know is how are they experiencing you, because there can sometimes be a mismatch.
Yeah. I was curious also if there are, really tactical tips for how to even set up the conversation to try to hit that Goldilocks zone. So anything, even as simple as like the environment in which you have the conversation. Are you walking? Are you sitting? Do you do it after a meal? Do you do it in the morning or the evening? Like, are there tips or at least truisms for things that tend to work better than others, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so I think it is about, and this is, I think any of those scenarios, those places or times can be good for couples. And that's where it's each couple has to know what are those times when we're best at our conversations. And that's some of that relational learning and knowing is when is the time of day, the place that works well. I mean, ideally, you're going to want to either be face to face. I mean, in the most ideal world, I think it's face to face, being able to look into each other's eyes, because that's where we convey so much information. I know for some people that they prefer challenging conversations shoulder to shoulder. So they're both looking forward. That's like on the walk or in the car ride kind of thing. At dinner, you're face to face more often than not. Sitting on the couch, you can turn towards each other. Ideally, I like to use this language of financial intimacy. What we're wanting to build towards is financial intimacy where we can safely look at each other to see each other's emotional responses. Part of what we know in intimate relationships is that despite cultural values of being ruggedly individual and responsible for our own responses, the couple science says we're actually co-responsible for each other.
Hmm.
So we don't give up responsibility for our own emotional regulation, but we are entrusting our emotional regulation to the other person, and conversely, they are trusting us. And so we're in this co-regulatory environment, or another word is interdependent.
Hmm.
We're not fully dependent on the other person to manage our emotions, but we're not fully independent of just doing it all on our own. We want to find that middle zone.
Makes sense. Uh, I'm not sure if this has ever come up in your practice or in your work, but just you know, given that money can be so sensitive and emotional and crazy making for some people, and difficult to talk about, do you have any advice for folks on how to even attract a partner in the first place who shares similar financial values as you?
That's a really great question. And I think when you look at the coupling research, and a lot has changed certainly with technology and many of the dating and connecting apps and websites, right? So that's put a whole nother spin on things where you can do a lot more filtering. You're also having to trust their honesty and integrity on those types of sites, which can be a funny thing to navigate. I'm a little still old school. I was in the dating pool before all that stuff got really hot. And I think there are still a number of people that partner through affinity experiences, right? So if it's a workplace environment, a professional organization, a social, commitment, a religious, spiritual community, basically you want to fish where you like being. Is a kind of a simple way to say it, right? And the reality is, in every intimate relationship, you're going to attract someone that shares some similarities, likely in financial outlook, and sometimes difference. And that's not necessarily a bad thing either, right? I think we hear a lot of times about, oh, well, I'm a saver and they're a spender. When seen as those are both good things when held in balance, the spender can help the saver open up and enjoy life a little bit more. The saver can help the spender see like the value of having some money set aside for security in the future. So that's where sometimes these polarities can actually be complementary if the couples will be open to seeing it that way and knowing that they're in it together and that each attribute has strengths and some limitations to it.
Makes sense. Suppose you meet somebody you really like, they're a great companion, they feel the same way about you, you think they're the one, but you do have these very different mindsets and behaviors when it comes to money. Realistically, can you really change these things about a person, and how? And if you can't, what advice would you have for folks, in this situation where they really feel like they found the one, but they're sort of entrenched in their money ways, and they're very, very different from each other?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a difficult spot to get to that place where you've invested a lot of time, emotional, psychological energy into partnering and feeling connected, and you're seeing that future relationship together. But you've identified a money behavior or thought pattern that is deeply incongruent with your own. I think that really does hearken, is that a deal breaker for you? I think one of the ones that comes up at this, especially in this relational stage, is prenuptials.
Say more about that.
Right. So prenuptials are that financial arrangement between a couple before they get married that says, if the relationship doesn't work out, here's what's going to happen with all the own money prior to us going into the relationship. That creates a lot of relational mistrust, and it communicates a lot of relational mistrust about the longevity of the relationship. But I have seen and worked with some people that are deeply committed to having a prenuptial. Sometimes that's because their own family of origin that they come from have set this requirement of them, especially in very affluent families. So that becomes a very tricky road for that individual to have to navigate, because they're having to navigate the loyalty to the family that they come from and the family money, and their desire to have a committed, open, we're going to be together forever mindset. So that if that's something that you may have to say is a deal breaker, unless they're willing to deal with that loyalty bind.
Have you ever seen this work? I guess my question behind the question is, can you really change people?
Yeah, so I think that's always that's a critical question in couples. Is couples need to have a felt sense of influence on each other. The challenge is that you can get into that dark gray black zone of becoming controlling and manipulative. That's a no-fly zone, and that is destructive for relational integrity in the long run. I think ultimately people need to have the space to come into their own changes and understandings of what's important. So that's where, kind of coming back to very early in our conversation, you're asking them those open-ended reflective questions. That's the way that, from my view as a therapist, people are most open to change. Is not when you come in, with your finger pointing, wagging them, you need to change, you're so bad at this, you're not good at that, you shouldn't be such a spender, it's such a terrible thing. We need to be saving so much money. That's not going to get someone to stop spending. That's going to create a lot of shame. And I see that in my practice a lot of time. That's where couples come in to me, is one partner has been very critical of the other partner's spending. That's a very common place where couples struggle. So what you can do to help your partner soften around that spending issue is become curious about what this shopping means and represents to them, because very likely what you think it is about for them is not actually what it is about for them. What we haven't really touched on is how our family of origin, the families that we grow up in, shape many of our money expectations. And until we become conscious of those experiences in our family of origin and the emotions that it left behind around money in money situations, the more likely we're going to be driven by those things at an unconscious level, and likely in less productive ways, especially when there's been emotional pain.
Mhm. What are some of the common scenarios or markers for how somebody's family or upbringing influences how their mindsets and behaviors about money when they are an adult?
Yeah, so I think one of them, well, there's a number of them, but financial secrets, there's a lot of anecdotal research and a little bit of empirical research that financial secret keeping is pervasive in our society and within the family and intimate relationships. And so this is where you can also see collusion between the parents and the kids that say, mom tells daughter, don't tell dad that we just spent, $300 shopping for clothes, because dad will get upset. Or, dad is stealing money from the kid's piggy bank or from mom to support their addiction. Right? So this is where we start to get into the deeper complexity and reality of life that many of us live in. You know, the research on attachment, which I referenced earlier, is relational attachment, and I use that as a proxy for healthy families versus less healthy families. It's not perfect, but it's a close proximity. About 50% of the population grows up in a securely attached environment, and what that means is that the parents are emotionally connected to the kids. They're able to balance the needs of meeting the kids with managing their own needs. The other 50% fall between anxious and avoidant attachment, which are miscuing in the emotional relational needs of the relationship between parent and child. So it doesn't take a lot of imagination to think, well, then if that's the context, what's going to happen around money? It's going to create some problems for feeling connected and attuned.
Hmm.
Um, I hope I haven't gone too far afield.
No, no, I think that, the theory is good, and it also helps link it to sort of applied practical considerations.